Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Hardboiled, Noir, detective fiction. This is Point Blank. Episode 1, The Killer Inside Me by Jim Thompson. Welcome to Point Blank Podcast. My name is Kurt, and I'll be one of your hosts for the show. And joining me, my co-conspirator in this endeavor, is Justin.
Hello, my name is Justin. I am here.
Yes, you are. And why are you here? We're here to discuss crime fiction, specifically hard-boiled noir and detective fiction. Why are we going to spend our time talking about death, murder, corruption, and all of the like?
That's a great question. I mean, really, what's wrong with us? Why this dark stuff? What is the draw? I'm an avid reader. I like a lot of different things. I like Westerns as much as I like noir fiction. But one of the elements to me that really is important in stuff I read is honesty. I like authors who try to deal with material that's either taboo or transgressive, that challenge society. I like stuff that comes from the margins. That's just me, but that's one of the things that draws me. How about you?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons, but I think one I can look back to is from the classic essay from Raymond Chandler, The Simple Art of Murder, in which he says that the big transition of hard-boiled fiction, and really this whole line of fiction we're talking about, is that it puts the people who do crimes in the role as the protagonist, or the protagonist isn't quite right in this term, but as the driver of the fiction. And through that, we can look at the entire motivations in some cases, maybe that's a little bit much, but why do people do the things that they do? And I'm a big fan of science fiction and fantasy. And one of the reasons I like that is because it can hold a mirror to society and tell us something about ourselves. And crime fiction is another genre that does that very strongly.
That's a good point. You got a degree in sociology, did you not, when you were in undergrad?
Yes, back in our alma mater there.
Shout out to University of Wisconsin. Woo! Not that we're like big boosters or anything.
Hey, I saw an alumni magazine in your bathroom.
We do have that, but they sent it against our will. We have no choice in the matter. We've never donated. I'm a terrible alumni.
Justin, our podcast is never going to make their magazine.
No, we're already blacklisted. But that's okay, because that's the territory of noir. Everything's doomed. But the thing about criminals as protagonists, that's an important feature of the fiction we'll be discussing. Now it seems commonplace to have anti-heroes or protagonists who aren't exactly likable, or protagonists who are actually troublemakers or bad people. But that wasn't always the case. There was something about fiction that was trying to uphold the high standards of society, whereas noir and crime fiction turned that on its head. The first book we're going to look at, The Killer Inside Me, by Jim Thompson, is a classic example of that, where he really pushed the boundaries of what is acceptable by featuring a protagonist who is not a very likable person. No,
he's not at all.
We both mentioned a little bit about, our interest in crime fiction. Do you have any goals for this podcast? Where do you see yourself down the line?
Well, my biggest ambition here is to do a project and complete the project. I mean, really, ultimately, it's to make this podcast and see what the reaction to it is. But I am very curious about this genre, and it's fairly new to me. I mean, there's been crime shows I've enjoyed, crime books that I've enjoyed through the years. I am a very avid reader across a lot of different genres, but there's something that's at least currently speaking to me in this genre right now that's a little stronger, a little louder than other things. And I want to explore it and see what it has to offer. And I do have, I'm one of those readers who sort of always says, well, I really want to write something. And I start and I stop and I don't really get anywhere. But I'm hoping that through exploring this, completing this project, that's a motivating factor for me to at least write, try writing some short stories and just complete them.
Finishing projects is difficult for some people. I've struggled with that in the past. That's how I used to be. I've changed since then. I do write, and I finished a few things and published some stuff. So I'm feeling more confident in my ability to finish projects. I also work on music, and I finished up there. So that's not a big concern for me in terms of my goals. But as somebody who teaches, I end up getting distracted by the needs of students and the needs of academia. And I don't get to read for myself that much. So having a podcast like this, one of the goals is just to keep me reading the stuff that I'm interested in. And, while pedagogy might be useful, it's not something I fantasize about on my weekends off. But I do fantasize about understanding the complexities of noir and crime fiction and where it comes from and how it all works together and who's who and why and what are the merits and the legacy of it. I love that stuff. I'm intrigued, and I'm really excited about how this podcast will force both of us to engage in this material and explore this weird and dark terrain. It's going to be fun, I hope.
Well, I certainly think so. Otherwise, I would have never asked you to do the show.
Goddamn right.
Listeners, you can blame me for this show. But, I was thinking, hey, I'm just an average reader, maybe a little more motivated or a little more interested than some. But so who would be a good choice to do this show with? And immediately I had to think of Justin. So he does bring the legitimacy to the show here and gives us a little academic clout.
Puts a little pressure on me because I don't know shit. But maybe I'm exaggerating. I do appreciate being invited to this show. I'm excited about it.
So just to let the listeners know what we have in store for them. Of course, this first episode, we are talking about The Killer Inside Me. Episode 2 is going to be Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett, one of the earliest hardboiled novels ever published. To let you know, we're going to start with kind of a base in the classics, but one of our big goals for this show is to get into sort of a classic and contemporary back and forth. So we do want to get into lesser known authors, newer things, but we also feel that we need to have a base, both for our own learning and just for everyone listening to the show. So we'll be moving into, with episode 3, we'll be looking at Raymond Chandler, looking at The Big Sleep, which is, probably the first real literary piece of detective fiction. Where are we going from there, Justin?
From The Big Sleep, which I will say is one of my favorite novels for many reasons, and I have my fair share of critiques about it too. We'll get there. That's episode 3. Episode 4, we're going to explore a slightly lesser known author, Charles Williams, who's famous, or at least infamous for his blue water noir. He was a merchant marine, I believe, for a time. So he writes really well about boats and maritime type stuff. We're going to be reading Scorpion Reef. The reason we're reading Charles Williams in part was something Kurt brought it to my attention.
Yeah, well, I have to say, like I said, I'd had interest in crime fiction series before and shows, but Charles Williams' work, especially this idea of blue water noir, was fascinating to me. I am a sailor. I'm very much into maritime stuff. I am a professional mariner working on ships in the Gulf of Mexico. And the way he wrote those scenes was unlike a lot of things I've seen in other nautical fiction. And there was a real level of honesty in his work. And he isn't published. So he's only available in ebook, I should say. He's not very well known, even compared to some of these other people. It led me down this road of exploring what was out there, and I liked what I saw. And in a lot of ways, that recommendation, I think it was from a podcast, so thank you, whoever you are. I don't remember. But that led us down this road to the show today.
Speaking of today's show, this is our first podcast episode, so, there's going to be a few hiccups. We're still working out the sound quality. Ultimately, we're going to be working in remote locations and talking about and analyzing books and authors apart, technically. In this case, we're actually here together.
Did want to give the listeners a little overview of each episode. Normally, we're going to be doing an introduction of what we're reading, writing, watching, things like that, just kind of what's going on, news. Then we'll move into a segment we're calling 5-Round Burst, which is 5 short reviews in about 5 minutes. And that's going to be a mix of classic and contemporary fiction. We may throw some related nonfiction books in there as well, just a short sample of what we've been reading. Then we're going to move into our main topic, which will be the core meat of the show. We'll have a book each week that we'll be discussing. We'll be doing a little investigation of the authors themselves and having a little more in-depth discussion about that book. Then we're going to move into a segment we're calling a
segment that we'll call Subjects Unknown. And this segment is sort of a jack of all trades, free for all. Sometime we'll be handling questions from avid fans, all four of you. You know, you can throw fiction, noir authors, or we might discuss some plot elements, or maybe take some time to explore a particular theme that's common in noir or crime fiction, like the femme fatale or crime in the city, or the role of organized labor in some of these books. And that's it. That's going to be the basic premise of this podcast.
Well, with that, we go on to our reviews. And welcome to 5 Round Burst. 5 Round Burst is where we're going to do 5 short reviews in about 5 minutes. We're going to try to provide a variety of reviews each episode, you know, a little bit for different tastes. We're going to throw in a little bit of nonfiction here and there. Generally, this is going to be hard-boiled noir and detective fiction, but I really do want to challenge both myself and the listeners to things outside of the genre. So, first up, today we have The Cold, Cold Ground by Adrian McKinty. This is the first Sean Duffy novel. It is a police procedural, which I normally don't like, but this one is a little different. It takes place in Northern Ireland in 1981 during the, one might say, the peak of the Troubles. Specifically, this is at the time of Bobby Sands and the other IRA martyrs' hunger strikes while they were in prison. So this gives the novel a lot of political tension. You've got the IRA, the Ulster Defense Force, the British Army, and the different police forces all working for their own agendas. And what makes Duffy interesting here as a detective is that he's sort of in the middle of everything. He's a Catholic officer in a Protestant precinct. This allows the reader to get many different points of view as the characters react to him and also accuse him of just about everything. And the main story here pulls from all those different sides, and it keeps you guessing throughout the narrative of the murder mystery. McKinty, who grew up in Northern Ireland, has been described as what you might get if Chandler or Hammond had been born in Northern Ireland. And yeah, I think that's kind of true. But this one is definitely a hit. I'll be looking at the rest of the series. Number 2, we have The Gun by Fuminori Nakamura. This comes from Japan, and it is a thriller of the building psychological variety. The basic plot here is man finds gun, will the gun corrupt him? The blurbs on the cover give it high praise, liking it to the works of Crime and Punishment or Poe. And now I enjoyed some of the lines, some of the set pieces within the story. And I'll be checking out the other work of the author. The Gun just didn't quite do it for me. It's a miss, but it's a near miss. And I know a lot of other people, including Justin, like this one, so we may take a look at it in the future. But for me, it's a near miss. Number 3, we have The Fast One by Paul Kane. It was published in 1932, and this is sort of one of those lost classics back in print. The printing is a bare bones thing. There's not a lot of extra information in the book. But Kell is our main character, and he's a prohibition gunman. And boy, is he a man of action. In under 200 pages, this thing has it all. Bootlegging, gambling, ships, femme fatales, double and triple crossings, gangsters, boxing, corrupt politician, car chases. Kane didn't want to leave anything out. And it's interesting here is to compare this to the other contemporary works, the ones that have survived more, the Hammett and Chandler's case. But by our modern standards, I think there's a bit too much going on per page, and this probably is reflective of the magazine origins of the genre. It does read a little bit like an extended magazine story, but it's still a hit, and it's still it's a good hard-boiled story from the era. Number 3, we have Sandman Slim by Richard Kedry. This is the first in the series, and this is one I'm bringing in as a crossover novel. It's really urban fantasy, but with a hard-boiled style. Stark, our main character, also known as Sandman Slim, is a tough guy magic user. He's a hitman for heaven and hell, and this is his origin story. as he comes back from over a decade trapped in hell as a live human, and he comes back with more power than he went in. It's written in that hardboiled style, and it would be a nice book for, say, an urban fantasy fan who wanted to try something more hardboiled, or a hardboiled fan who's looking to try urban fantasy to see what's out there. So, like a stake to the heart, this one is a hit for me. And 5, last but not least, we have a bit of nonfiction, and this is Mastering Suspense, Structure, and Plot by Jane Cleland. This is one of those how to write books there's enough tools in here to justify the cover price. Just say that right off the bat. After you get through the writing 101, which all of these books seem to need to have, you'll find ideas on subplot, clues, red herrings, and suspense building that should be pretty helpful. One downside that I noticed is that I was looking for more of the harder noir elements, and that wasn't really in here. And for a book that had suspense on the cover, I kind of thought I was going to get that. But the author is mostly known for her cozy mysteries, and I think that sort of is what makes the difference here. So I didn't get the examples I was necessarily looking for, but I did get a lot of tools that I thought were useful. So that is our five reviews for today. 4 hits and a near miss. So pretty good shot pattern there. That's it for 5-round burst, and we're on to the main topic. Welcome to Central City, Texas, home of Lou Ford, Deputy Sheriff, and the setting for our novel today, The Killer Inside Me. In this novel, Lou comes across as a regular guy, a small-town cop full of cliché sayings and plenty of platitudes. But under this thin veneer lies the mind of a sociopath. In the opening pages of the book, Lou is asked by Sheriff Bob Maples to go out and talk to a woman named Joyce Lakeland, a suspected prostitute. Lou and Joyce quickly form a physical relationship that awakens Lou's sadistic sexual desires, releasing what Lou calls the sickness from inside of him. We discover that Lou sexually assaulted a young girl when he was a teenager, a crime for which his stepbrother Mike took the fall. This landed Mike in prison, and after prison, he died on a construction site, a death that Lou feels was a murder orchestrated by local building and real estate magnate Chester Conway. Lou plans his revenge on Chester Conway by setting up a blackmail plot with Joyce. Unless the Conways pay up, Joyce will expose her affair with Chester's son Elmer. Chester asks for Lou's help in handling both his son and the money. Once they have the money, Lou tells Joyce that they will leave Central City. Lou really has other plans. On the night of the drop, Lou double-crosses both Elmer and Joyce. He savagely beats Joyce. When Elmer arrives, Lou shoots him and sets up the scene to look like a lover's quarrel. To Lou's surprise, Joyce lives, but she's in a coma. Lou must form a strong alibi and start framing others for the crime. Conway and Sheriff Maples arrange for Joyce to be brought to Fort Worth for further treatment, as Conway wants to see Joyce executed for the crime. Lou goes along but waits at the hotel as Conway and Maples go to the hospital. A clearly shaken Maples comes back to the hotel, telling Lou that Joyce has died during the operation. They return to Central City, where Howard Hendricks, the county district attorney, isn't so sure that Lou is innocent. Joe Rothman, a labor organizer, also seems to know more about the situation than he lets on. And Lou must deal with his longtime girlfriend and fiancée, Amy Stanton. Amy is suspicious of Lou, as she knows he's been lying to her and has cheated on her. Lou's mask of sanity is starting to come undone. Meanwhile, the DA arrests a local youth, Johnny Pappas, for the crime. Johnny has in his possession one of the marked bills used by the Conways to pay off Joyce. He received the money from Lou, but so far has not revealed that to the police. Johnny and Lou have something of a close relationship, as Lou has helped Johnny out of trouble a number of times. He requests to speak with Johnny in his cell. There, Johnny claims he won't say a thing. Lou confesses to Johnny and then strangles him in his jail cell. making the scene look like a suicide to cover his tracks. Now things are looking worse and worse for Lou as the town becomes more suspicious. Joe Rothman suggests that he leave town. Amy wants to elope. Lou is then confronted by a bum who tells him that he knows that Lou did it, and he wants a payoff to keep his mouth quiet. The payoff is scheduled for the same day Lou and Amy plan to elope. When Amy is ready to go, Lou turns on her and beats her to death. When the bum shows up with the money, Lou chases him down in the street claiming that he killed Amy. The bum ends up shot and killed by another deputy. That night, Sheriff Bob Maples kills himself out of grief. The DA and a deputy then confront Lou and try to get a confession. Lou refuses. However, in Amy's belongings, they find a letter in which Amy begs Lou to come clean. On this evidence, they arrest Lou and send him to an asylum. A few weeks pass and Lou does not break. A big city lawyer, supplied by Joe Rothman, shows up to get Lou out. New evidence has emerged. In the final confrontational scene at Lou's house, he is confronted by the authorities. A bruised and battered, but very much alive, Joyce Lakeland is revealed, leading to the final explosive ending.
We're exploring the work of Jim Thompson, who is a well-known noir author who may not have the acclaim of Chandler and Hammett, but he's up there. He was born in Oklahoma Territory in 1906, the town of Anadarko. His upbringing was a large influence on his life. In addition to that, his family was an important factor in his upbringing, particularly his father, who played numerous roles in life, from crappy dad to sheriff to oil man, a lot of ups and downs that heavily influenced Jim in the way that he portrayed males and authority figures in his fiction. He began writing at an early age and wrote through his 20s and 30s, but he didn't really become established or famous as a crime writer until his 40s, when he really broke through with a novel we're exploring today, The Killer Inside Me. This novel, released in 1952, began the golden era for Thompson, when he was at his most productive, one novel after the next over the period of a couple years, where most of his best fiction was written. From there, he had his ups and downs as a screenwriter in Hollywood for some time, and as a married man with children. And ultimately, he died in LA, 1977, with his popularity waning. It wasn't until the 1980s, when I believe Black Lizard republished most of his work, that he regained his prestige and legacy, and he became known as one of the most important writers in the noir genre.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things about Thompson's biography is, and this is true of a lot of us, that what happens in our teens and early 20s shapes us. Mm-hmm. And Jim's life, his father had ups and downs, his family had ups and downs financially, and they were particularly on the downslope when he was a teenager. He ended up working as a bellhop in a fancy hotel. This is during Prohibition, so a lot of the things he had to do was like get booze for the patrons, get them drugs, prostitutes, all these sorts of things. And so in some ways, he was injected into a life of crime at a very early age. And after that, he went through a period of working very tough physical labor jobs in the oil fields of West Texas. And this is in the early days where oil drilling was done mostly by hand. And it's in this area that he very much identified himself with the working class. He met members of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a radical labor union at the time. He met hobos. What was the songwriter that he met, Justin?
When he was working in the oil fields of West Texas, he met Harry Haywire McClintock, who is a well-known wobbly, meaning an IWW member, a radical anarcho-syndicalist union that's still prominent, but more so back in the day. McClintock is known as a writer of labor classics as Big Rock, Candy Mountain, and Hallelujah, I'm a Bum. He's a major player in labor history in the United States, and it's interesting to note that Thompson was right in the center of that.
Yeah, certainly the Depression, Prohibition, and this early exposure to the type of labor and labor organizers that he experienced is something we're going to see in his fiction and throughout his life.
Definitely. And again, the influence of his dad was huge on his fiction. His dad once played a role as a sheriff, or worked as a sheriff. Playing a role might actually be more accurate, because he ended up bilking the county out of a lot of money and got run out of town. And I think this shaped a lot of the sheriffs that we see in Thompson's writing. So much of his fiction is, in a way, autobiographical.
Speaking of sheriffs, let's talk about our main character in today's piece of fiction, Lou Ford.
Lou Ford is one of the most memorable main characters in all of crime fiction. I'm haunted by Lou Ford. I'm haunted by his cool, calculating self, the masks he wears, the way that he speaks to you as a reader, the way that he speaks to characters in the story. I mean, this is Thompson crafting a really interesting, complicated character, not just some cut and paste, two-dimensional noir bad boy.
Oh, yeah. And I also think when we look at Lou Ford, I would make the argument that every corrupt police person in fiction after the release of this book is somehow influenced either directly or indirectly by Lou Ford. That's how monumental of a character this is in American fiction.
Yeah, I think so. And I think he became the archetype for so much serial killer fiction. Stuff that Patricia Highsmith does. She often has psychopathic or unstable main characters, from people like Lindsay's Dexter and Silence of the Lambs. This idea of making a serial killer so that they're not just entirely unlikable, but someone who one can relate to on some level. It's pretty groundbreaking stuff, especially coming out in 1952.
So when it comes to Lou Ford, is there anything we dislike about using this character?
Jim Thompson took a huge risk. He got paid by Lion Books in 1950 or 51 to write this book, and it could have just been a paint by numbers hardboiler. Thompson sort of rewrote the plot that he was given and turned it into this. So he chose Lou Ford. That being said, I don't see some Achilles heel problem.
The one thing I can say about this is that there are a couple moments where this hokey, down-home, aw shucks kind of guy, like most of the time it's not too thick, but there's a couple of moments where you're like, really? People don't see through this? Or maybe that's just a modern reader. I don't know. Yeah,
so Dumb Lou from Kalamazoo sometimes showed his hand a little bit too much to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Thompson, well, here, if you haven't read this book, the way that Lou Ford presents himself to the rest of the town is that he's this all shucks sort of down home countrified guy who speaks in aphorisms and isn't very intelligent. Of course, this is just a hoax. It's a mask. So Thompson wants to really show this, really demonstrate this repeatedly when Lou's acting out in public and speaking with people, especially when he's trying to hide his true intentions as a killer. Maybe he oversteps it a little bit. Maybe it starts to wear on us because while he's presenting himself in this way to a variety of different characters, we just keep seeing it. We're just sort of bludgeoned with it. Maybe that effect was conscious. Maybe he wanted to make us sort of sick with it, the way that as we know more about this character, we're actually as repulsed by his fakery as would be, for example, Bob Maples, the sheriff, who started to suspect him, knowing him as a good person his whole life, but now suspecting him as being pretty much unlike anything he expected.
You're kind of saying that Thompson almost infects us with the sickness that Lou Ford says he has as well.
Possibly. I mean, he does so with the scenes of violence in this. He could have certainly toned down the violence. I'm glad he didn't, but the way that he writes violence is so visceral. If I were to be nauseous by violence, there's some choice lines in this text that make the violence physically repulsive, especially when Lou is beating on the two women characters.
Yeah, well, so Lou's ultimately he is a force of evil.
Yeah.
But he's a very powerful character. So do you have any characters in this that, maybe give us a little good in the world?
Yeah, of all the other characters in this book, I really like Sheriff Bob Maples. I think Bob Maples, who starts off as, a co-worker and colleague and maybe a little bit of a father figure to Lou Ford, ultimately seems to be the first person to suspect him when things get sketchy. We see Bob suspecting him with this undercurrent of sickness because it's almost like he gets really drunk in one scene because he can't handle the thoughts he's having, imagining Lou being such a betrayer, such a liar. So I really love to see Bob Maples as one of the few characters who has a conscience in this story, or at least where the conscience is visible to us as readers. It helps to offset the harsh reality of Lou as being this person who's absolutely despicable.
Yeah, I mean, Bob, definitely, I get that from Bob. And another character that I find interesting, I'm not necessarily sure what to make of him, though, is Joe Rothman, the head of the local union. He does serve a purpose in the plot in that he's sort of adding some elements of the backstory that otherwise might be hard for us to get. And I also think that he serves this purpose of being I believe he's from outside of the area originally. So he has to kind of ask those questions of, oh, so how did this happen back when? But he always leaves this sense of like he knows more of what's going on than is actually stated. And in some ways, I feel like he is a character who is revealing maybe not the good or the bad, but maybe the reality. That he does make some negative comments about other characters in the book. He's on to Lou probably before anybody else is, that he's up to something. But he is playing his own game, which is his politics.
So perhaps he's the most pragmatic?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think he's out for not just his own interests, but the interest. I mean, he's a union organizer, sure. The interests of his workers, yeah. Who do indirectly play a role in this entire plot. Yeah. And I think that he's playing his own game, and he wants him not necessarily to win, but he wants to come out looking okay.
Yeah, I feel like every time he enters the story, there's a moment, there's like a pause in the forward motion, but we seem to gain a lot from their dialogues. He seems to be a revealer. The way Thompson presents him, he doles out information to Lou and sort of helps Lou to recognize that he's not getting away with what he thinks he's getting away with. Okay, so there are a lot of plot elements that are interesting in this book, and stylistically, Thompson makes some interesting choices. But I really want to explore one aspect of the theme, and that is the psychological dualism and the way that mental illness is presented, particularly the way Thompson presents this duality in the character of Lou Ford. Does he do a good job? Is this a politically correct way of presenting mental illness? But also, how does the portrayal of somebody with split personalities like Lou Ford, how does that work for the reader? Is it effective?
Yeah, it's hard to speak about the mental illness issue. I don't know.
Yeah, it's true.
Does he portray? It seems believable to me.
Yeah.
I think I'd be curious. I highly doubt that his medical diagnosis that he uses in the book is at all current or necessarily even accurate. But we all are familiar with the idea of a psychotic serial killer because these people exist. There are Ted Bundys in the world. There are Jeffrey Dahmers in the world. There are people who unfortunately do these sorts of things. And in some ways, he's not even as bad as those people. But what is interesting here is we do see somebody who's not completely taken over by this urge to kill people. He's certainly not stupid. He's highly intelligent. He's, reading classic works of philosophy and doing advanced math and stuff like this. But yet he's also very isolated, and then he's never left the town. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but he's never done that. He's never tried to advance beyond the position that he's in. But he has this whole persona, and that I do think that had he not done this in such a duality of the personality, it would not have worked as well.
The way that it's presented makes it work. I can only imagine how many times Thompson tried to write this book, and if he struggled to get the point of view right or not. I know that happens in my own situation at times. Perhaps he knew it right away. To dive into the mind of a serial killer and see what sticks, that would be an interesting, experiment for any writer. Thompson nails it here. In general, I think, as far as I can tell, it feels right. It feels natural. I think the on and off switch that Lou turns on and off over the course of the book when he's playing other people, when he's speaking to us in internal monologue is effective. And I think that the way that he hides his agenda and his true intelligence is both revealing about him as a person and even more insidious and frightening than just the dumb psycho who doesn't really think clearly about their actions or doesn't care. No, in the case of Lou Ford, he very much is cognizant of his choices and he's calculating. And this is, to me, incredibly frightening. Didn't you see the movie version of this, and find it not to be as impressive as the book?
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it.
In the book, it's first person. We hear Lou Ford because he's speaking to us. But in a movie, how did that translate? How do you get his thoughts? Or do you?
That's what didn't really work about it, is you get this over monologue kind of in certain spots in the film. And then once basically you have two characters on the screen, it doesn't work. In the film, when you're watching it, it's like, why wouldn't these people see through him? Not right away, but very much earlier in the storyline. It just fails. If anything, it actually speaks to what Thompson achieved even more. Yeah. And I think there's a reason why the director Stanley Kubrick said that of this book, that it was the most chilling and believable first-person story of a criminally warped mind he had ever encountered. That's a pretty good endorsement.
Yeah. And then they ultimately, later on, they worked together on a few screenplays. We'll get to that in a moment. One more thing about the film. I think Lou Ford is such an interesting character because he's so hard. It's so hard to buy into somebody who is so dangerous as a protagonist. And when he speaks to you, he's charming, he's affable, he's interesting, he's intellectually curious. All these things that are in a lot of ways desirable in a character, he's telling that to you, the reader, and exposing his true self to you, so you feel like there's more to him than what other people see, which is just sort of like a dumb yokel. In the movie, you can't, if you don't see that charming underbelly or that deep intellect, you're just seeing a dumb yokel who kills people. And how long is that going to be sustainable? It's so two-dimensional. So that's pretty much what I thought about in terms of theme for this book. Anything else related to that before we move on, Kurt?
No, I think it'd be good to talk just a little bit more about the structure of the book.
Sure. With crime fiction and noir, you're going to get some heavy plotting, and you're going to get hit or miss character development. A lot of these books, depending on how quickly they were written, if they were written for magazines or serialized or what, there's a difference between a Chandler and a Joe Sixpack writing in Black Mask. I wanted to think about Thompson, and I thought about the key elements, rising action and conflict and resolution, and in terms of acts, and, what is the structure? Was he conscientious throughout this text? There are three major moments where the character is either pushed forward or pushed beyond the point of beyond, where they can no longer go back. These moments that happen that are crucial to the structure of the story. Pretty much right at the quarter mark of the book, Joyce is killed by Lou Ford. That sort of sets the story into motion. We get to see who Lou is. We realize what kind of person he is, and we see him covering his tracks. The midpoint of the book, right when we're sort of wondering, where we're going with this, that's when Johnny is killed. He's the second major character who's killed off, an unexpected one, and one that deepens Lou Ford's situation, deepens his complicity, further entrenches Lou Ford in his role and ultimately in his fate. And then right at the three-quarter mark, right when we're entering that moment of ultimate conflict and resolution, that's when the final major character is killed, and that seals the coffin for Lou. It's the third killing is when people in the town start to turn on him, where the jig is up. And at that point, that's the beginning of the unraveling and his ultimate demise. So I would say, just from a structural point of view, I think that Thompson put a lot of effort and energy into making sure that this book was balanced. And I think it really translated. It's a kind of invisible thing that occurs in a book. You just feel like everything's happening at the right place. That, in this case, seemed to be a conscientious design.
Yeah, I would say that, I didn't look at it in those regards, but as a reader, it comes across, it's paced well. The beats hit at the right time. It flows nice, and it keeps you interested.
I think it works.
Well, what I think is amazing, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think that he wrote this in a relatively short amount of time. So this came out in 1952. This is a period where Thompson would go on to write 12 novels in 18 months. In some of these novels are Savage Night, A Hell of a Woman, Nothing Man, After Dark, My Sweet, and The Kill-Off. Some of these are great novels. Many of them are. Many writers would be happy to write such a novel. But, I don't know what it was about this period, but he was extremely productive. Well, what's interesting here is this book came out in 1952, and I don't think that's a small thing. First of all, because it puts it in the historic context of crime fiction. It makes it very early for this kind of book. But To me, one of the things that I wonder is like, what's it like to pick this book up in 1952 and read it? I mean, we're kind of given this version of 1950s America where this kind of thing just doesn't fit in.
That's true. I mean, we have the white picket fence America post-World War. And of course, there's this whitewash sheen of what the world was like back then, which a lot of which is propaganda. But, there's this after World War and before the 60s, the birth of the baby boomers and all this sense of American exceptionalism. Hell, World War II never came to the United States outside of Hawaii. So we escaped a lot of the carnage and existential hardship that forced Europe into self-reflection. In that world of lawnmowers and microwave, it felt like we can live in this sort of utopian capitalist bubble. This is a bubble that Thompson popped with sort of no-holds-barred noir that confronted the very delusions that we were experiencing by creating a character who is supposed to serve as a traditional good old boy who respects and actually is a representation of authority, who takes care of a small town and protects them. But lo and behold, this character is not at all what it seems. Just like David Lynch in Twin Peaks, the reality is far different than what it appears at its surface. At least now in the 21st century, we're a little bit seasoned to this type of bleak narrative. In 1952, I imagine it came as a shock.
Yeah, I mean, you would have been available on a wire rack at a gas station or a dime store or something in middle of anywhere, America. And finding that and picking it up, I mean, obviously you're going to be thinking something when you pick up a book with The Killer Inside Me, but you're probably not expecting this. And I wonder, that myth of the 50s, to me, like the 50s is a time that's like rife for this kind of thing. It's ripe for horror, and like there's a huge amount of anxiety, like layered right between the surface. I mean, in some ways it's worse than the World War II and the 40s era, because you actually have the underlying thing of like the nuclear bomb and all of this other like Cold War threats and all this other stuff emerging that can really completely destroy humanity in a way. But what Thompson doesn't get into those types of global things, but what he does speak to, and this is Stephen King notes this in his essay about The Killer Inside Me, but he loves Jim Thompson. And he says that Thompson speaks of emptiness. He speaks to feelings of loss in a land of plenty and unease amid the conformity of that 1950s America and the feelings of alienation. And I think Thompson does that very well.
I think Thompson is very conscientious of these themes. As a laborer, as somebody with a difficult upbringing, somebody with who migrated looking for work and was exposed to radical ideas about structural injustices in society, he was very conscious of this greater world, and a lot of that world was distilled and infused in his books. And he was not going to let something like the delusion of 1950s American post-war utopia get in the way of what he saw as a real existence. It isn't the bomb in the distance and everything's all right here. It's the fascists are out there and there's no way we can hide from them anymore.
And what Thompson does, and this is another thing from Stephen King, is that he identifies Thompson as writing the great American sociopath, wherever that sociopath comes from in American society. And I think you do see that in Thompson's work. Now, you talked about his politics a little bit. Let's bring that back in, because it's hard once you've read the biography, and we haven't mentioned the biography that we read for this, but it's Savage Art, a biography of Jim Thompson by Robert Polito. And first of all, this is an excellent biography. I don't really like biographies that often, but this one is a 5-star biography. Jim Thompson is an interesting character. Polito does a wonderful job of doing interviews and getting background on Thompson's life. But one thing that we find is we mentioned that early exposure to radical labor organizers in his youth, and that's something that he would maintain pretty much throughout his entire life. In the 30s, he is connected to the Communist Party in Oklahoma, and we have to remember this is the Communist Party in the United States before World War II, and he's part of the Works Progress Administration, their writers program in Oklahoma that was employing out of work writers in this time frame, and he was doing working class histories of the people of Oklahoma. And through this work, he would meet people like Woody Guthrie and other organizers during the Great Depression. And he had his comings and goings with the Communist Party. He was never targeted during the 50s, during the Red Scare or anything like that. He does say that his exposure to Marxism, and I'm talking Marxist like philosophy, sociology, Marxist history, that kind of thing, the analysis of class, is something that allowed him to do the crime writing that he did. Now, he never gets into extreme examples of how that applies to his fiction, and I wouldn't call him a political writer, but he does say that that view of society is what allowed him to break these things down and tell these stories. He had a Marxist philosophy. He was, at a time, a member of the Communist Party. But a friend named John Hammond from Columbia Records said that Jim's point of view was more of that of an anarchist and not that as a communist. I don't know if Jim ever actually identified that way, but he definitely dismantles things even further than, your typical socialist point of view.
Yeah, I don't really see Jim as a joiner in the sense that he's going to lockstep with any particular political ideology. He had obvious labor tendencies and he was pro-worker. But, the slippery slope of Marxism is the same slippery slope of Christianity. You get in too deep and you start to think of it in terms of religious sort of contexts. And that seems to be something that Thompson readily avoided. He was a loner. He operated as a lone wolf. But ultimately, I think that the politics were crucial to shaping this sort of class awareness in his writing. The fact that he escaped that sort of ideological dogmatism. Fortunately, Thompson stayed away from polemics in his writing. There is labor or class analysis stuff going on. It's in the way the characters are developed and the emotions and experiences of the plot and people in the story, and not pummeling the reader with particular radical viewpoint. So thank goodness for that.
Well, let's move on a little bit into the legacy of this book and perhaps the legacy of Jim Thompson.
I think this book has had its ups and downs, but now it's known, I think, widely as a classic of noir literature, as a classic of serial killer literature, and as one of the most effective examples of a unreliable narrator, somebody you can't exactly trust. And Thompson has been assessed time and again, and I think his current assessment is of one of the top 3 or top 5 crime fiction or noir writers in 20th century crime fiction.
I think if you look at the list of people who attribute things that they learned from Jim Thompson, the number of writers, critics, movie producers, or directors, I should say, maybe he's not as big a name for readers. But when you look at the people who are creating other things that we know so well, it's hard. You can't dismiss him. If you have names like Stanley Kubrick and Stephen King saying that this guy is perhaps one of the greatest American novelists, then I don't think that's something you take lightly.
No, you got to take it seriously. And Chandler and Hammett, both of our authors that we'll get into in the next couple episodes, exploring their detective fiction, they're rightly well regarded for the genre that they essentially created and pushed to literary heights. Thompson is on par with them, but more for what he's done to noir. And I think as noir literature gets reassessed and some of these old or lesser known authors get spotlights placed on them, Thompson will continue to rise to the surface as the cream of that crop.
One of the big things for Jim Thompson is I think he's one of these people who creates a transition within the literature, and that, Chandler and Hammett are great, but they also wrote a few years before he did. And in Thompson, think you start to see these more modern ideas. Like he has moments, even in other books that I've read of his, some of them aren't that great, but he still has moments of brilliance, and he has ideas and scenes that are just like, where on earth did this come from? And they still stand out to this day. And to have that level of creativity is certainly worth remembering.
One last thing on him as a writer. I don't think his dabbling in darkness was fakery or fad. I think Thompson was a complicated, troubled human being who suffered debilitating alcoholism and depression for much of his life. And much of his writing was a way of trying to save himself, trying to dig out of the darkness. And it's reflected in its authenticity. And I look forward to reading more of his work. to wrap up, I think we both have two quotes that we'd like to share. I think you from one of the texts, and I have one in addition. This is actually from an essay entitled Dark Poet of the Plains. It's written by Wheeler Winston Dixon. Thompson's best work mines the darkest recesses of the human condition. His true territory is the human mind and how it snaps under pressure. I think this effectively conveys the key to much of Thompson's written work. It's this dark exploration of our universal human condition, and it's in part, and particularly, it's related to how the mind works and how the mind goes bad and how it snaps and what the aftermath of that is. He's a complicated individual who wrote a lot and very effectively, I think, about the human mind. Kurt?
This line here from the closing of The Killer Inside Me, I think this sums up Jim's work. All of us that started the game with a crooked cue, that wanted so much and got so little, that meant so good and did so bad. All us folks. Me and Joyce Lakeland and Johnny Pappas and Bob Maples and big old Elmer Conway and little old Amy Stanton. All of us. All of us. And welcome to Subject Unknown. This is the portion of the show where we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of random different topics as the show progresses. It is episode 1. We wanted to start somewhere with what are our definitions for some of these major categories that we're going to be talking about in the show. So thought we'd start out with at least what I consider the big umbrella term, crime fiction. How are you defining crime fiction, John?
Crime fiction is sort of the overarching blanket term that covers most of what we're going to be exploring in this podcast. I mean, it's any fiction where crime occurs, essentially.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. And for me, this is going to be the most blanket, the most all-inclusive term. And it's also going to be something that I'm going to use, to be honest, to talk about some genre crossovers and that sort of thing. And I agree with you that key part of that crime is the major driving force of the plot. And I think you see that not just in mystery and suspense fiction, but you see that all over the place as well.
It's going to be useful to us as we move out of some of the classics of detective and noir fiction, because clearly detective fiction, 99 times out of 100 is crime fiction. Noir is often crime fiction, but not always. But there are a lot of genres that we're probably not going to spend too much time exploring. I'm not exactly riveted by courtroom dramas. And while we'll explore some suspense and some thrillers, it really depends. Some of that stuff will work for this podcast and a lot of it won't.
How about cozy mysteries, Justin? Are you looking forward to talking about books where cats solve the crime?
I am a big fan of cat-solving mysteries. I do not read cozies, and while I recognize that they're popular, and I tip my hat to Agatha Christie and the golden age of mystery fiction, we're not going to be spending too much time on whodunits.
No, I don't think that's the plan here. However, at some point, it's going to cross over. Mm-hmm. And, it might be kind of interesting down the road once we've established our perspective on this to look at one classic and just kind of see how we feel about it. But anyway, yeah, so we're both on the same page here that crime fiction is this big umbrella term that we're using. I don't think we're too different on that one.
From crime fiction, we get into more subgenres. One, which I guess we'll start with, is detective fiction, where there's some kind of investigator or a detective. Some cases, this is a professional, a PI, like Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe. In some cases, it's a cop, and in other cases, it's just an amateur.
Well, Justin, for me, one of the hard things with coming to terms with this genre was the term detective fiction, because I'm not a fan of the police procedural. I'm, like you said, courtroom dramas, they don't really do it for me. They can, both of those subjects can, but it's an exception. I found a definition of detective fiction that made me a lot more comfortable with calling something detective fiction. And this is from an essay called The Typology of Detective Fiction by somebody's name who I am about to butcher. Tzvetan Todorov. Well, sorry there, Todorov. I apologize. Maybe we'll just cut the name out. But anyway, the point that he makes in this essay, and I do think that this is interesting to differentiate, is he's basically saying that there are two stories going on. One, there's a story where a murder or a criminal act happens, and this usually occurs before the narrative of the story begins. But that is one story. The second story is about the characters that reveal the elements of that first story through their investigation and through the reveals of their actions during the course of the story. And I like that because it takes the element of who is a detective and makes that anybody who is investigating the mystery in any shape or form can fill that role of detective. And I like that because I like the idea of more average people trying to solve the unknown.
I'm with you there. We're both working class. I'm drawn to the every man and every woman stories. I like stories that happen in the streets and that are accessible to the average person, not in terms of dumbing downness, but the fact that anybody can feel enabled to pursue and solve crimes is something that is appealing to me. Whereas the problem with police procedurals and that type of thing, CSI type stuff, is that the excessive use of expensive and hard to understand technology removes the average person from the equation. They're reduced to a spectator while the experts take care of business. And I'm not in any experts. I like it when the experts are pushed out of the way and crime is in the hands of regular people, victims, perpetrators, and problem solvers.
One of the things, too, with that definition that I thought was interesting is the differentiation between detective fiction, where you have the crime, the story of the crime is revealed through the clues, and the difference between that and a thriller. And that the thriller, I guess this makes complete sense once you hear it, but I didn't think of it this way, is that what makes a thriller is that you get the perspective of the perpetrator at the same time as the people investigating the crime. So you know how things are moving as the reader from both sides of the equation. And I did think that was an interesting distinction to throw in there.
I think a lot of detective fiction, the ways in which the genre shifts and the ways that the author focuses the reader's attention is really the reader's perspective. How much does the reader know? And how does the author dole out information? Does the reader know what crime has occurred and where the perpetrator is? Are they waiting for the detective to catch up? When you know there's a bad guy behind the door, but the detective doesn't, that creates that antagonism inside the reader where they have that emotional reaction. They're yearning for the detective to know something that they don't have in terms of information. So that's one way authors play with the reader in terms of creating suspense. And not all stories happen that way. Sometimes the reader has as little information or the same amount of information as the detective. So they're learning the story as the story progresses.
As you change just subgenres within this overarching umbrella, you raise the question of does the detective even really need to do the investigating or have clues? And that's, in some ways, that's what hardboiled fiction came as a response, that you don't need, the detective is just going to come in and punch somebody in the jaw and move the story right along. So what's your definition for hardboiled, Justin?
Well, I don't have a very solidified definition. I do recognize hardboiled as much for, differences in content, a variation on the theme of detective fiction, but so much of hardboiled is its style. It's the way that it's presented. It's the tone. It's the language that's being used, more of a street slang, colloquial language. There's a lot of action. Oftentimes there's a lot of sex. It's saying goodbye to the countrified, cozy, cat-solving mysteries. See, the baseline in like cozies or golden age mysteries is sort of like a middle-class, high, safe society. And then a bad thing happens, a murder, a kidnapping or whatnot. And over the course of the story, people work to solve the puzzle, then they solve it, and then things go back to the safe, normal, cozy country life from whence they came. In the case of hardboiled, things aren't looking too good from the start. It's a rough life, people on the streets, there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of corruption, and sure, the PI, there's always going to be some kind of investigator, some kind of detective, amateur or professional. They come in and work a case. Oftentimes the case turns out to be bigger, more complicated, more nuanced than they originally thought. And at the end, they may or may not solve the case after a lot of action and trouble and roughhousing, but the city isn't fixed. There's never a baseline of safe, harmonious, peaceful coexistence. There's always the recognition that the world's rough and there's never going to be the ultimate solution to the criminal element. And I like that. I think that's the key component of hardboiled. It's gritty and it's a little more world weary.
I agree with most of that. There's a couple little differences I think that I have, but you talk about the violence going into the city. And I think that is one of the biggest things about the hardboiled genre. And it's been noted that is a reaction to basically the loss of the West and the transition from the Western, in that as America became urbanized, now the violence used to be on the edges of society. And now it is coming back into the urban environment. And that's not entirely historically true, but in literature anyway, that's what you're seeing hardboiled being something of a response to. But I did have a couple of things. Some of these are repeats from you, but I had a list here that said, you've got an urban setting. You have a frequent use of violence and fast-paced dialogue, often to move the plot along and to move the investigation along. And like I said, there's not a detective with a magnifying glass looking at footprints and things like that all of the time. A lot of time it is just either intimidating or pursuing someone to see what happens. And I think we'll see that in Red Harvest a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And you're right about the private eye character, but now I'm thinking about a book I reviewed in our 5-shot burst for today's episode, Fast One by Paul Kane. The main character there is a gangster, and it's definitely hard-boiled fiction. There is an investigation involved, so I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I think from the work of Hammett and Chandler being so much higher on the pedestal of what is hard-boiled, that maybe we're kind of overlooking a little bit of, or maybe people have put that up so high as to what hard-boiled is.
I think you're right in drawing a distinction between hard-boiled and hard-boiled detective. There are both. Not all noir is hard-boiled. Not all hard-boiled is noir. Not all hard-boiled detective fiction. Like, there's distinctions, and you can have a hard-boiled style without having a detective as a primary character. But like you said, the Chandlers and the Hammetts of the world have sort of elevated and equalized the two terms, so that when we think detective, we often think hardboiled and vice versa. You're right. I guess there are some cases where hardboiled is just the style. There's not necessarily a primary detective going through a moral existential crisis solving crimes. There's other things happening, and there's other players that are serving as protagonists.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it if we want to say the hardboiled is a stylistic choice. And if you want to add something else onto that, hard-boiled detective, hard-boiled whatever, to further clarify what it is, that's fine. I think I've read books that are hard-boiled fantasy. I've read hard-boiled science fiction. So yeah, I think it is a stylistic choice. And the one thing I did want to add, and I just want to emphasize that I think this is important because hard-boiled transitions into noir in some natural ways, but the idea that this involves police corruption, government corruption, business corruption, and a lot of that is a response to prohibition. And I do think that is key to changing the types of mystery and suspense fiction that we're talking about, because that is something I see in the literature that I like moving all the way into the modern era of what I'm liking that's coming out right now, whether that's Nordic noir or other detective fiction and hard-boiled fiction in here from the U.S.
Sure. You'd be foolish to ignore the historical realities surrounding a lot of the development of any literary genre, from Victorian fiction to hard-boiled detective fiction. But the 1920s and 1930s were a huge historical moment. Post-World War I, Prohibition, the flappers, the extravagant wealth, the Great Gatsby era, and then the Depression. Those are some huge highs and lows that sort of caused some growing pains in this country and created, a bit of a moral crisis. And a lot of that came in the way that certain literary writers and hard-boiled writers handled the material. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that was a crucial component. And then noir, which came a little bit later as a straight genre, and film noir in the 40s, 50s, deepened that as World War II came. And then things got really bleak. And there's a lot of existential angst. And I think that there was a reflection of that where life and art sort of imitated each other.
Yeah, and bringing up noir, where we're really bringing up the most difficult of our definitions here, because I think I've seen this word used and misused in so many different ways. I'm just going to throw out a pet peeve. Is I recently ordered a book, a series of guidebooks to noir fiction, and then right in the introduction, the author says that they use noir to cover all of crime fiction. So basically, using our definition of crime fiction, but using noir to make it sound more sexy and sell more books. And I really disagree with that, because there is under his definition, something like Agatha Christie is noir, and that is not noir to me.
Any practitioner of noir, anybody who takes noir seriously as a genre, knows that it's not a catch-all term. It's a specific type of writing, and not even Raymond Chandler is noir per se all the time.
I don't know. My definition of noir, there are points, but I also think noir is a little bit like something like pornography. You know it when you see it. And in this case, maybe you know it when you feel it. Because for me, what is noir is very much an emotional response.
Yeah, there's a tone, there's an aura to it. In the same way that hardboiled has a style, noir has a certain style. It's a style that's translatable from genre to genre. You can have noir western, you can have noir sci-fi, you can have probably a noir courtroom drama. So it's a template. And sure, a lot of what we know about noir that comes out of film noir, the chiaroscuro, shadowy, black and white, the way that bad guys and good guys sort of blend together, and a lot of these stylistic effects. But when it comes to literature, when it comes to the kind of type of fiction, noir fiction that we're going to be exploring, the way I see noir, the thing that stands out to me is that things are bad and they're not going to get any better. Yet you're pretty much starting at the curb and you get kicked to the gutter. There's no bright side. There's an overall tone of oppressiveness oftentimes, and there might be lighter moments, but they're limited, or they're there as flourishes. Here's a quote from a website called The Defective Yeti. A noir story can be grim and suspenseful, or grim and melancholy, or grim and paranoid, or grim and fatalistic, but it's pretty much always grim. For the most part, I agree with that. And I think that there's a long track record of noirish tales going all the way back to Shakespeare. But it's the notion of the protagonist being somebody who's doesn't have a lot of luck, or doesn't have a lot of skill, or has a mix of poor luck and bad skill and just having a rough day. But everything that they pursue turns out not to really work out in their favor. And so that adds to the tone and deepens it.
Yeah, I did think that was interesting when I was looking at these definitions, that noir definitely goes back much further historically than kind of the detective, certainly hardboiled, but detective fiction in general. Like, there is kind of there are some writers in the mid 1800s that you can kind of identify as this is where mystery fiction started. But noir, in that does predate all of this by a lot, going back into the Greek tragedies and the works of Shakespeare and everything. You can see elements of that story because it's a classic story. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to noir, perhaps the strongest. But there's a couple of things that I got from a book called Crime Fiction by John Skaggs. There's a protagonist that exceeds the law, or I guess so they're breaking the law themselves to do whatever it is. I think that could also apply to morals, maybe not just structured laws themselves. That the protagonist often comes from the lower class. I don't know if that's entirely true, but I do think there's something to that. They have some outsider qualities. They're not necessarily in the mainstream of society. It's often from the point of view of the person who committed the crime. But I think if the protagonist is exceeding the law in some way, or the moral average, I guess, of the society that they're in, like, that's the point of view. Like, I don't necessarily think that noir has to have a character that commits a full-blown crime. They can have a series of like little indiscretions that lead to the same kind of feeling. And then the last one is that noir should have a social perspective, that it should have some commentary on society, law, or justice and corruption in those systems. And I think that's another one that really draws me to this category.
I have a quote here from Andrew Pepper. He wrote this essay entitled The Cambridge Companion to American Crime Fiction. And he speaks to some of the central themes of noir from his perspective. The corrosive effects of money, the meaninglessness and absurdity of existence, anxieties about masculinity and the bureaucratization of public life, a fascination with the grotesque, and a flirtation with and rejection of Freudian psychoanalysis. I think this fits fairly well, in addition to some of the stuff Kurt said. Another quote I have from Otto Penzler, who's a student of noir and a writer, and he edited a fine collection of noir. In addition, he edits quite a few things related to crime fiction. But he wrote, "The people in noir fiction are dark and doomed. They are losers. They are pessimistic. They are hopeless. If you have a private eye, the private eye is a hero, and he's going to solve the crime, and the bad guy will be caught, in most cases. However," Otto says, "that's a happy ending, and that's not a noir ending." Have we covered noir? There's a tone, there's an atmosphere. The perpetrators often made a series of bad choices. Sometimes it's outright crime, sometimes it's crime-ish, but it doesn't end well.
Or it can end ambiguously, I think. And I think, just from our discussion here, I think we can agree that noir is the hardest to put your finger on. But it's also, in many ways, I think that's why I find it the most interesting. It sounds like you find it pretty interesting as well.
Yeah.
But we will be covering all of these, and I think those are good definitions for us to start with. Yeah. And, I don't know that we need to come back to any kind of definition of crime fiction because it is such a umbrella term, but it might be interesting to look at these more specifically in a little more depth sometime in the future, after we've read a few more hard-boiled stories, some detective fiction, some noir fiction, maybe fine-tune these definitions down the road. And before we close out the show, Justin, is there anything you'd like to plug? Any projects or anything?
Yeah, actually, it's not so much a project, but good news in the publishing world for me. I have a story that's currently out in Meridian, which is a magazine based at the University of Virginia. I love this magazine. I've wanted to get a story in it for a long time, and I'm happy to report that they published my short story titled Sea of Tiny Leaves. So if you're interested in hearing or reading about kind of stuff that I do, it's not noir, but it has some elements. Check it out. Go to their website at readmeridian.org. How about you, Kurt?
Well, Justin, I don't have a project of my own that I want to plug, but I do have a project from a friend of mine. This book is The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion by Margaret Killjoy. And this is more modern fantasy. It does have investigative elements, which is why I'm going to plug it here on the show. It is the first of the Daniel Kane novels, and this is a novella-length book. But Kane is a queer punk traveler who is investigating why a friend committed suicide. And she travels to a utopian town in the middle of America. And very soon in the novel, she encounters a blood-red three-antlered deer who feeds on the flesh of other animals. And this is the beginning of an occult investigation, which, Kane becomes a demon hunter along with friends and allies within the utopian town, as well as adversaries. To me, at first, this was sort of like a punk rock Buffy the Vampire Slayer sort of thing. I enjoyed that element. The novel was fast-paced, fun read. I pretty much finished the whole thing in one sitting. In fact, I'm pretty sure I did. I did have access to an advanced reader's copy, and Margaret is a friend of mine, so keep that in mind. But I do want to say that it is available now. It's available for order online and your bookshops, and it is getting just over 4 stars on Goodreads right now with almost 50 reviews. So I'm not alone in thinking that this is a really fun read. It's unlike a lot of other things that I've read in the past, mostly because the characters. The punk rock characters speak to me and, in my experience, a little bit more than other characters in occult investigative type stories. I think you might want to check this one out if that's your kind of thing. The book was fun. The cover art is great. It looks like a metal album, and the story sort of reads like the art of a metal album come to life. So strongly recommend that. That is The Lamb Will Slaughter the Lion by Margaret Killjoy, and that's available from Tor Publishing.
And that just about does it for Point Blank Podcast Episode 1. If you're interested in keeping up on the reading or following with us over the course of the next few episodes, Episode 2 is Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett. Following that, we'll be exploring The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. Episode 4 will dip into Maritime Noir with Charles Williams' Scorpion Reef. If you want to check us out on the internet, we have a Facebook page. Look us up at Point Blank Hardboiled Detective Noir. If you want to send us an email, our email address is pointblanknoir@gmail.com. Or you can find our webpage where we have additional information on some of the texts we've read or on the authors we're discussing. You can find us at pointblankpodcast.com. Finally, we have an iTunes page, and we want you to check it out. The more clicks we get on that page, the more likely we are to continue this project. So go to iTunes, click that you like us, and check us out for future episodes. We plan on doing one at least once a month for the foreseeable future. If you have any friends who might be interested in our podcast, please tell them. If you have any questions about who we are or what we're doing, or you have any ideas on books you might want us to cover, please get in touch with us. We want to hear from you. Until next time, thanks for listening.